Every civilization reveals its architecture of belief in the moment it begins to crack. In 1970s New York City, that crisis and conflict culminated in the headline, "Ford to City, Drop Dead." New York in the 1970s was not merely a city in trouble. It was the leading edge of a systemic reckoning. The end of an age that had assumed growth without constraint, welfare without limit, and credit without consequence. What unfolded in 1975 was less a local emergency than a structural parable. How prosperity, by its very logic, generates the conditions of its own fragility. The fiscal crisis of New York became a laboratory of modern governance. It exposed the recursive link between expansion and dependence, between idealism and indebtedness, between autonomy and external control. When the city nearly defaulted, it was not simply because its leaders mismanaged budgets, but because its institutions had evolved in perfect harmony with the optimism of the post-war era. An optimism that could no longer finance itself once the economic winds reversed. From that collapse emerged a new grammar of power. Oversight boards, conditional loans, austerity as discipline, and the moralization of fiscal restraint. These would become the operating system of late 20th century governance, in Washington and Warsaw, Detroit and Athens alike. The logic born in New York that aid must follow reform and reform must precede rescue became the unwritten law of the globalized economy. To read the 1975 crisis, therefore, is to glimpse the larger choreography of modern systems, expansion yielding dependency, dependency yielding collapse, collapse summoning control, and control redefining freedom. What happened in New York was not an aberration, but a prototype. The moment when the city, like the age itself, discovered that survival demands equilibrium between generosity and discipline, autonomy and oversight, belief and balance. Today, we trace this transformation not as mere chronology, but as a sequence of interlocking tensions, expansion and dependency, concealment and collapse, reform and control, austerity and renewal. The city's near-death and revival form a complete circuit, a demonstration of how modern systems survive by oscillating between generosity and discipline, between faith in progress and fear of ruin. New York's ordeal, like the metropolis itself, belongs to everyone who lives by credit, confidence, and the fragile equilibrium between the two. The post-war decades gave New York its golden glow. Gleaming skyscrapers, bustling factories, and a municipal faith that prosperity would never end. Under mayors Robert Wagner and John Lindsay, the city extended a generous social contract. Free tuition at the City University, expansive welfare programs, world-class hospitals, and a rapidly growing public payroll. Between 1960 and 1974, the number of municipal employees per capita rose by about 70%. But the engine of this benevolence was fiscal dependency, federal aid, rising taxes, and relentless borrowing. When the national economy cooled in the early 1970s, this dependency collided with industrial decline. Factories shuttered, middle-class families fled to the suburbs, and the tax base just crumbled. New York's social generosity created fiscal reliance, and that fiscal reliance deepened into economic fragility. The city had become, you might say, a house supported by borrowed beams. New York's post-war generosity was not unique. It actually foreshadowed a larger post-industrial dilemma. The city's crisis exposed what happens when social ambition exceeds economic adaptation, a pattern later mirrored in Cleveland's default in 1978, Detroit's bankruptcy in 2013, and even in certain European municipalities after the 2008 financial crash. The deeper revelation was not simply that growth must have limits, but that prosperity hides its dependencies. The very revenues that support social idealism, they depend on the economic structures that idealism often neglects. The lesson, therefore, is cyclical. Every age of confidence constructs the terms of its own restraint. Rather than confront the imbalance, the city's financial stewards embraced illusion. Through the late 1960s and early 70s, they borrowed just to pay operating expenses, shifted costs into the capital budget, and even, believe it or not, dipped into pension funds. By 1975, $2.6 billion in short-term notes had been rolled over so many times that they were, for all intents and purposes, just perpetual debt. As investors started to doubt the city's books, confidence really began to erode. In 1974, wary banks demanded punishing interest rates to buy New York's bonds. Borrowing led to concealment, concealment to distrust, and distrust to even murder. Destined concealing. Stuck in the city and deep. When the commercial banks finally refused to underwrite new city debt on May 2, 1975, Mayor Abraham Beame faced the abyss, a payroll he just couldn't meet, services he couldn't pay for, and a city that was poised to default. The fiscal whirlpool that engulfed New York became a model case for the dangers of accounting illusion. The same feedback logic resurfaced in the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s and the subprime mortgage collapse of 2008. Moments when creative finance delayed reckoning until disbelief became systemic. The insight is not that debt is dangerous per se, but that trust erodes geometrically once transparency fails. Markets forgive extravagance longer than they forgive deception. New York's downfall revealed that confidence is the first asset and the last collateral of any complex economy. Governor Hugh Carey, newly elected and pragmatic, stepped into the breach. In June 1975, he created the Municipal Assistance Corporation, or MAC, chaired by banker Felix Rohatyn, and soon after, the Emergency Financial Control Board. The logic was simple. The state would help, but only if it ruled. MAC issued bonds backed by diverted city taxes and demanded sweeping austerity. A wage freeze, higher transit fares, and tuition at the previously free city university. Thousands of city workers were laid off. Oversight, reform, and austerity formed a tight triad. The first enforced the second, and the second justified the third. The control board model, which was born right here in New York, actually travelled pretty far and wide. Philadelphia in 1991, Washington, D.C. in 1995, and Puerto Rico in 2016 all ended up under similar regimes of external supervision. These structures work precisely because they suspend that old binary between autonomy and discipline. The real revelation here is institutional. Democracy from time to time actually needs trusteeship just to preserve itself. A community that can't self-correct invites a temporary sovereignty above it, not as some sort of punishment, but more like a mechanical rebalancing of the civic will. As New York was begging for federal help, President Gerald R. Ford found himself at a real moral and political crossroads. Speaking before the National Press Club on October 29, 1975, he made it clear he would veto any bill to rescue the city. "The people of this country will not be stampeded," he said, into footing the bill for New York's mistakes. Ford's principle of fiscal responsibility fused with his political calculus. But it was the perception that really made the Union explosive. On October 30th, the New York Daily News translated his message into that immortal headline, "Ford to City, drop dead." Even though Ford never actually said those words, they totally captured the moral distance between Washington and Gotham. In the triadic resonance between principle, politics and perception, Ford's prudence became cruelty in the public eye. Ford's confrontation with New York established a template for how political virtue becomes mythic vice when filtered through mass communication. Later presidents, from Reagan's hard line during the Patco strike in 1981 to Obama's resistance to unconditional bank bailouts in 2009, all faced versions of the drop-dead paradox, principled restraint perceived as heartless refusal. The deeper pattern is that moral austerity and political empathy rarely coincide in real time. History's judgment shifts with the cycle of necessity. What seems cruelty in crisis may later read as courage. Of course, the inverse is also true, and New York's example shows us that a plan for reform is needed to transform austerity from cruelty to workable constraints. The headline landed like a blow. Panic rippled through City Hall, fear swept the boroughs, and yet from despair came defiance. Public employees, teachers, police, sanitation workers who had already sacrificed wages and even invested pension funds to keep the city afloat, now took to the streets. Union leader Albert Shanker's dramatic October 17th pension investment of $150 million had bought the city mere days of survival. Now his members and others carried drop-dead, Ford buttons through the avenues. Fear bred protest, and protest bred a fragile civic solidarity. New Yorkers refused to die quietly. The spontaneous solidarity of 1975 prefigured later civic awakenings, from Solidarity in Poland to Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter, moments when fear and grievance condensed into a moral identity. The resonance of New York Fights Back endures because it proves that solidarity is not born of comfort, but of common peril. Every metropolis that rediscovers itself under siege reenacts this pattern. Resistance converts despair into belonging, and belonging redefines survival as defiance. As Governor Carey slashed budgets and unions conceded further, Ford's stance softened. On November 26, 1975, he acknowledged that New York had begun to bail itself out. That same day, he announced a proposal for temporary federal loans. Turkishilm. Congress passed the New York City Seasonal Financing Act on December 9, 1975, averting bankruptcy. The loans came with strict conditions, yet they restored credibility and allowed the city to breathe again. Here, the sequence reversed. Internal reform generated solvency, which enabled federal support. It was a non-linear rescue. The city saved itself first, and only then was saved. The non-linear rescue of New York, reform first, assistance second, became the silent architecture of later interventions, from International Monetary Fund, conditional lending in the 1980s and 90s to the European Union's post-2008 austerity frameworks. The pattern suggests that external rescue is sustainable only when it ratifies internal transformation. Aid can delay collapse, but it cannot replace the moral economy of reform. The revelation here is paradoxical. Salvation is most enduring when it arrives disguised as the demand to save oneself. Austerity now ruled New York. Under state supervision, budgets balanced annually, services were cut to the bone. Between 1975 and 1977, 67,000 municipal jobs vanished. Class sizes swelled, firehouses closed, and the once-free City University of New York now charged tuition. Yet within the pain, discipline bred stability, and stability allowed recovery. By 1977, under Mayor Ed Koch, the city achieved its first balanced budget in years. By the early 1980s, credit ratings improved and Wall Street boomed. The triad, austerity, stability, revival, formed a self-reinforcing equilibrium that redefined the modern fiscal city. The equilibrium New York forged through austerity prefigured the fiscal conservatism that dominated the late 20th century. Balanced budget amendments, privatization drives, and the notion of fiscal discipline as a civic virtue. Yet the revival of the 1980s also revealed the cost: widening inequality and eroded public infrastructure. The lasting insight is really dialectical. Stability purchased through contraction breeds future volatility. Every society that trims itself into balance must later confront what it has cut away: capacity, compassion, or imagination. The aftermath transcended the balance sheets. Washington's reluctant aid became the precedent for conditional rescue. New York's ordeal fostered a new creed of self-reliance. And the headline, "Drop Dead," became myth, retold in classrooms and campaigns. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter extended long-term federal loan guarantees, but no city since has received comparable help. Drop Dead thus came to signify the enduring federal ambivalence toward urban distress. Forward to city. Drop Dead survived as more than just a headline. It really became a parable of federal ambivalence toward urban life. Each crisis that followed, Katrina's devastation of New Orleans, Flint's water emergency, the fiscal strains during the pandemic, all of them reopened the same old question. Just how far will the nation go to extend its care to its cities? The myth endures because memory itself actually performs a political function. By retelling stories of abandonment, cities reaffirm their identity as survivors. The real revelation here isn't just cynicism, but continuity. It's the realization that self-reliance and collective memory are the twin currencies of urban endurance. From expansion to dependency, then from dependency to collapse, and from collapse to reconstitution, New York's near-death experience traced a complete logical arc. Expansion, dependency and collapse to control, reform and solvency, and then to austerity, stability, and finally, revival. Each stage, in its own way, corrected the excess of the last while, at the same time setting up the contradiction of the next. Beneath all the headlines and heroics, the city was really living out a philosophical truth. Survival depends on this dynamic balance between generosity and restraint, autonomy and accountability, pride and humility. New York did not die in 1975. It learned, through the dialectic of collapse and recovery, how to live within limits without surrendering its defiant soul. Across all these echoes, Cleveland, Detroit, Puerto Rico, the Eurozone, and the crises yet to come. Of 1975 emerges. Systems survive not by avoiding contradiction, but by learning to oscillate within it. New York's crisis was not an aberration, but a rehearsal for the rhythm of modern governance, the swing between expansion and restraint, autonomy and oversight, empathy and discipline. Each triadic tension endures because it is structural, not circumstantial. The revelation is therefore not that New York was saved, but that cities live by the same logic as consciousness itself. They reform only when the cost of illusion exceeds the pain of truth, and they recover not through rescue, but through recognition. If New York's near death revealed the logic of interdependence, it also posed a question that still remains unanswered. Can we act before collapse makes reform inevitable? Every generation inherits not the security of solvency, but the illusion of permanence. The same triads that once bound Manhattan, ambition, credit and trust, now bind nations, markets, and even the climate itself. We borrow not only money, but time, consuming tomorrow's stability to preserve today's comfort. The lesson of 1975 is no longer municipal, it is civilizational. When belief in endless expansion collides with the limits of the real, societies face the choice that confronted New York: to correct themselves by reason or by crisis. The city's survival proved that reform born of necessity can still create renewal, but it also showed the cost of waiting until necessity rules. What then should we do? We must recover the discipline without surrendering the imagination, to rebuild systems that measure success not only in balanced ledgers but in sustained trust. We must design economies, cities, and institutions that anticipate correction rather than collapse, that treat transparency as infrastructure and foresight as the new form of compassion. The call is simple, though its fulfillment is not, to learn from the logic before we are forced to live it again. New York's ordeal was a rehearsal. Ours need not be the encore.